There's a specific kind of quiet that certain people spend their entire lives chasing. Not silence exactly, not emptiness, something more precise than that. It's the feeling of walking into a room where nothing is asking anything of you, where the walls don't demand your attention, where the surfaces hold only what was placed there on purpose. Most people walk into a room like that and feel vaguely unsettled, like something is missing, like the space is waiting to be finished. But then there are the others, the ones whose shoulders drop the moment they cross the threshold, the ones who exhale slowly like they've been holding their breath for years without knowing it. If you are one of those people, this is about you. And I think somewhere underneath all of it, you already know that what you're really looking for was never about furniture. We tend to explain minimalism in the language of aesthetics, clean lines, neutral palettes, the 30-item wardrobe. We frame it as a trend, a reaction to consumerism, a design philosophy for people who read too many Scandinavian architecture blogs. But that explanation has always felt hollow, hasn't it? Because the people who were truly drawn to minimalism, not as a performance, but as a genuine pull, a gravitational need, they weren't inspired by a mood board. Something in them was already like this long before they had a word for it. And the real question, the one that almost never gets asked, is why. Not why minimalism is beautiful, but why certain nervous systems seem to require it the way lungs require air. To understand that, we have to go somewhere most people don't expect this conversation to go. We have to go inside. Psychologists who study human well-being at its most fundamental level, not happiness, not success, but the deeper question of what makes a person feel psychologically whole, they kept arriving at the same three things: competence, relatedness, and autonomy. That third one is the one that matters here. Autonomy is not just independence, it is something more intimate than that. It is the felt sense that your life actually belongs to you, that the choices you make, the space you move through, the way you present yourself to the world, that all of it is a genuine reflection of who you are, rather than a performance of who you were told to be. When that feeling is present, something in a person relaxes at a cellular level. When it's missing, something quietly erodes, like water slowly hollowing out stone. You can't always see the damage, but it is happening. People with a strong and innate need for autonomy, and research confirms this is a trait that varies meaningfully across individuals, are measurably more likely to make deliberate, values-driven decisions about how they live, including, and this is where it gets interesting, how they design the physical spaces around them. For these people, a stripped-back room is not an absence of things, it is evidence. It is proof, visible and tangible, that the environment belongs to them and not the other way around. Most people move through spaces without ever feeling that distinction, but people wired this way can't stop noticing it. The cluttered room doesn't just feel messy to them, it feels like a small surrender, like the space has already decided something about who they are before they even had a chance to speak. But there's a second thread running underneath this, one that is quieter and perhaps more revealing, and it has to do with sensitivity. I know that word can feel soft, almost dismissive, but stay with me here, because the research points somewhere genuinely surprising. The people who are most drawn to minimalism are often among the most intensely feeling people in any room. Not the most expressive, not the most dramatic, but the most internally alive to what is happening around them. They pick up on tones of voice that other people miss. They register the emotional weight in a room before a single word has been spoken. They feel transitions, losses, shifts in relationship, the slow accumulation of unspoken things more acutely than most people ever will. And that sensitivity, that particular way of being porous to the world, is the very reason they need less of it pressing in from the outside. Psychologist Elaine Aron spent decades studying what she called highly sensitive people, a trait she estimated appears in somewhere between 15 and 20% of the population, and critically, she found that it is largely innate.
It is not something that happens to you, it is something you are born being. People who score high on sensory processing sensitivity are measurably more affected by environmental stimulation. Bright lights register more intensely, noise carries further, crowds cost more, and physical spaces, the visual texture of a room, the way objects accumulate and compete for the eye's attention, all of it registers at a higher volume than it does for most people. These individuals consistently report preferring quieter, less cluttered environments, not because they have refined taste, but because their nervous systems are genuinely asking for it, the way a fever asks for a cool room, the way exhaustion asks for darkness. Which means that for a meaningful portion of the people drawn to minimalism, it was never really a choice, or not a free one anyway. It was a biological negotiation, a quiet and ongoing attempt to lower the volume of a world that was always coming through just a little too loud. And here is where it gets important to understand something about the brain itself. Think of your mind as a phone with a battery. Every single thing in your environment that catches your eye, the pile of unopened mail on the counter, the stack of books you keep meaning to get to, the drawer that doesn't quite close, each of those things uses a small but real amount of processing power simply by existing in your field of vision. Not because you are consciously thinking about them. Your brain is still registering them, still running a background process, still allocating a portion of its resources to manage the unfinished quality of them. A 2011 study on cognitive load found that when multiple unrelated objects compete for your attention simultaneously, the brain cannot give full processing power to any single one. It splits, it fragments. And for most people, that fragmentation is a low hum in the background, noticeable, maybe, but manageable. For someone whose sensory filter is thinner, that split is not background noise. It is the difference between a day where thought can actually complete itself and a day where everything feels harder than it should, without any obvious explanation. The tiredness that sits behind the eyes before noon, the strange irritability that has no clear source, the feeling of reaching for a thought and finding it has already scattered. These people don't become obsessive about their spaces because they are controlling. They become obsessive about their spaces because they have learned, sometimes through years of trial and error and unnamed exhaustion, that this is how they protect the one internal resource that matters most to them, the capacity to think, to feel, to be present in their own life without the constant interference of visual noise.
The writers who work in nearly empty rooms. The artists whose studios look like they haven't started yet. The thinkers who remove everything from a surface before they can sit down and concentrate. They are not performing discipline. They are quietly, almost desperately, protecting something. But even this doesn't reach the deepest layer. In 1988, consumer psychologist Russell Belk proposed something that has sat underneath conversations about possessions and identity ever since. He called it the extended self. The idea is this: we do not experience our belongings as separate from us. We absorb them. They become part of the psychological architecture of who we believe ourselves to be. The car, the books on the shelf, the clothes that feel like armor, the objects that signal something to the world about the kind of person you are. Most people build their sense of self outward, layer by layer, accumulation by accumulation, until the picture feels complete. The things they own become a kind of evidence, proof of a life, proof of a person. Minimalists arrive, often without knowing how, at a different conclusion. They come to sense, sometimes consciously, sometimes only as a wordless discomfort, that a self built on objects is structurally fragile. Objects disappear, they break, they get lost. The version of yourself that required them to exist doesn't survive their absence. And so, slowly or sometimes all at once, these people begin to orient toward an identity that does not require inventory to feel whole. They want to know who they are when the room is empty, when the signals have been stripped away, when there is nothing left to hide behind and nothing left to announce. Just the person, alone in the quiet, finding out whether they are still there. It is a conclusion that takes most people a significant and often painful amount of loss to even begin to approach. A divorce, a move, the slow disappearance of a life they had built around things that turned out to be temporary. But for people drawn to minimalism, something in their architecture has always been moving toward that question, sometimes long before life gave them a reason to ask it. And this is where the story starts to get complicated. Because that same sensitivity, that same deep need for autonomy, that same hunger for an identity that doesn't depend on what's in the room, under enough pressure, those traits don't disappear, they just shift. They become something harder to look at, something that can look, from the outside, almost exactly like clarity and intention, but isn't. There is a version of minimalism that has almost nothing to do with peace, and if you have lived through a difficult season, if you have felt the particular grief of a relationship ending, or a version of yourself dissolving, or a life rearranging itself in ways you did not choose, you may have met this version, even if you didn't recognize it at the time.
Picture someone 3 days after a breakup. Not the crying on the floor kind of 3 days, the eerily functional kind, where they've gone quiet and started moving through the apartment with a bin bag. The ex's things go first, then the things that were adjacent to the ex, then the things that were just there, taking up space, making the room feel like before. And from the outside, it looks like getting your life together. Maybe it even feels that way for a moment. But what is actually happening is something psychologists call compensatory behavior, using concrete, controllable actions to manage feelings that are abstract and beyond control. Every object that leaves is a small hit of agency, proof to yourself that you still have power over something, even when everything that actually mattered slipped through without warning. The problem with small hits is that they wear off, so you need another one, and the threshold for what counts as excess keeps quietly creeping lower, until the simplicity that was supposed to feel like freedom starts to feel like its own kind of cage, just a very clean, very photogenic one. The person isn't building spaciousness anymore. They're building distance from their grief, from whoever they were before everything changed. And this is the tension that lives inside minimalism that almost no one names out loud. The same traits that produce something genuinely beautiful in a stable life, the sensitivity, the need for autonomy, the desire for an identity that doesn't depend on things, those exact traits become the tools of avoidance when life applies enough pressure. The wiring doesn't change, only what it's being asked to carry. So the real question, the one worth sitting with, is this. When you clear a surface, what are you actually making room for? Presence or distance? Clarity or control dressed up as peace? Because if it's the former, that is something worth protecting. But if somewhere underneath the clean lines and the empty shells there's a grief you haven't looked at yet, minimalism will keep the room tidy. It will not do the harder work. That work looks quieter than decluttering. It looks like staying in the full room long enough to feel what it brings up. It looks like asking your nervous system what it actually needs, not what your habits have trained it to reach for. It looks like being willing to sit with the mess that isn't in the corner, but inside your chest, and choosing not to organize your way out of it this time. You are allowed to need less. You are allowed to build a life that feels like yours down to the walls. But you are also allowed to need more than an empty room. You are allowed to need people, warmth, the beautiful clutter of a life fully lived. Those two things are not opposites. They never were. If this video put words to something you've been quietly carrying, you are not alone in it. There are more people than you know sitting in their carefully cleared rooms, wondering why the quiet still isn't enough. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into the things that are hardest to say out loud. It means more than you know.